All right, we've got some quiet. We're ready to go. So this next panel session, is titled Enhancing the Connection Between IRWM and the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, and that would be the compliance activities. So I'm going to turn this over to Dave to do the introductions. This is Dave Orth, and then after that we'll have a very quick setup presentation, and then turn the subject loose to the panel.
Thank you, Mike, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm David Orth. I have a lot of different hats and experiences, but my current capacity is a member of the California Water Commission, so nobody hit me up for money, and also a member of a principal of a consulting firm that's done a lot of SGMA implementation work, primarily in the private sector in the San Joaquin Valley. And so I'm really pretty excited about this panel this afternoon. I have a extensive experience in both creating and managing a very successful integrated regional water management plan in the Kings Basin, and you're going to hear more about that from Eric Osterling here in a bit. Eric worked with me when I was at KRCD up until about 2 years ago, and then had the, I don't know if it was the honor or not, but I was part of the negotiation process for the actual drafting of SGMA. Sat in the governor's conference room and with the legislators and other policy folks. I sat there on behalf of the Association of California Water Agencies and developed the act that we're all now trying to live with and force into, you know, this broader framework of California water planning. What I want to do is give you just a couple of pieces of background to set this up, and then as Mike said, we're going to have him give a brief presentation on how this issue is set up in the stakeholder document. I will introduce the panel here in a minute, and then each of the panelists are going to answer or speak to kind of 3 questions that we've been presented with, and then we'll come back to you and hopefully have 5 or 10 minutes to have your input through a Q&A process. So let me just start real quick with, you know, reminding us all that integrated water management, you know, became part of the California legislative process through SB 1672 in 2002. We've seen a significant level of effort in many, many areas of the state. And this isn't a perfect quote, but I recall Mark Cowan repeatedly when he was the Director of Water Resources stating that integrated planning is a foundation or framework of California water policy. Along comes 2014, we passed the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, and it sets up some mandatory requirements for the management of groundwater in prioritized areas. You know, we've seen the maps. It's virtually, 80% of California's groundwater use is now subject to a sustainable use objective by 2040 or 2042, depending on whether you're critically overdrafted or not. Both acts were founded on a fundamental state policy, and that is that management of water is best accomplished at the local level or at a regional level. I think as we look at SGMA, you know, it makes some connections with planning, but it makes connections more with the general planning, land use planning processes, and directs groundwater sustainability agencies to present their plans to the land use agencies and vice versa for, you know, some level of coordination and consistency, but it's a pretty soft connection, right? It's a dotted line that's got a lot of space between it. And SGMA is pretty quiet about IRWMs. And, you know, I'll let you all decide if that was an oversight, a missed opportunity, or intentional. I will say that as we sat in the room, it was very important to the drafters of the law to allow the local agencies to form around whatever level of governance and structure was going to allow them to achieve sustainable management of the groundwater. So I sat in there, you know, as the general manager of Kings River Conservation District, administering this very successful IRWM, and thought all the way through the Kings Basin Water Authority is going to be the GSA for the Kings Basin. I mean, gosh, we spent 10 plus years building this thing, and it's just going to naturally morph into that IRWM. And instead, and Eric will tell you, it did just the opposite. The GSA formation in the Kings Basin went back to kind of the standard business as usual water agencies going back and trying to figure out how they can manage their resources. I would suggest that that's because we had two different drivers and two different starting points, right? Integrated management is all about a vision. In the Kings, it was all about prioritizing project needs and collectively pursuing funds. SGMA, on the other hand, is all about allocating and using a limited, restricted resource in a way that creates competition, if you will, within the subbasin. And it's those two things that create some challenges. So enough of me. Let me introduce the panel, and then we'll ask Mike to come up just for a minute. We have some great people here, and everybody, if you look at their bios in your packet, you're going to see that they all have vast experience in both integrated planning and groundwater management, and many of them are involved in SGMA. Lance Eckhart here is the Director of Basin Management Resource Planning for the Mojave Water Agency, and is, in charge of directing the agency's urban water management plan, integrated regional management plan, groundwater management plans. He clearly has the ability to talk about how some of these things all fit together. Courtney Howard is the Water Resources Division Manager for the County of San Luis Obispo Public Works Department, and has experience in developing and local and countywide water plans and groundwater management studies, and is involved in the SGMA practitioner panel. John Ricker is the Water Resources Division Director for, they didn't sit in the order of my bio, so I apologize. John is the Water Resources Division Director for Santa Cruz County Health Services Agency Environmental Health Division, and a Director with Santa Cruz County Resource Conservation District. He's involved in the Santa Cruz Integrated Regional Water Management Program, and is the lead staff for SGMA implementation in 2 basins in Santa Cruz County. Eric Osterling, Water Resources Manager for Kings River Conservation District, my last public agency employer, is the program manager and administrator for both several of the GSAs that are forming, as well as the Kings Basin Water Authority integrated planning process. And then lastly, John Woodling, Executive Director of the Regional Water Authority, lots of experience in groundwater management in the American River Basin, the groundwater basin in Sacramento County. John has, worked with DWR clearly in both the earlier stages of IRWM and in developing groundwater management programs. So again, I think a great panel. We're going to hear from him in just a second, but Mike, if you could come up and give us some context.
Thanks, Dave. Good afternoon, everyone. Just to set the stage a little bit more, Dave did a great job doing so far, so I'm just going to add just a little bit, and then we can let the panel go. So I want to introduce this document to those folks who are not familiar with it. It's the stakeholders document for sustaining and strengthening integrated regional water management. This document was created over a series of 3 years. Very broad stakeholder reach out efforts all across the state, total of 10 workshops and a lot of other engagement activities that went into this. Stakeholders worked with us. They were very patient. They worked very hard. We got a lot of great input. Some of that input relates to groundwater, of course. So just real quickly in this document, by the way, there's some copies of it on the table. Back where the gentleman, Gary, could you raise your hands? And there's some of the documents there, as well as there are some outside. So if you don't have a copy, feel free to grab one or come see me. So just a real quick overview of the document. 4 key strategies for the future of IRWM are identified in the document. And those are improving alignment, strengthening practices, improving services, and communicating the values of IRWM. Those are the 4 strategies, and there's some subcategories, and there's 70 actions, a total of 70 actions under all of that. So groundwater, actions specifically related to groundwater are kind of sprinkled all through the document. So if you have a chance, take a look, and you might be interested to find out what's in there. So a couple of key points that coming out of the practice, or out of the effort to put this plan together, or this report rather, was that stakeholders recommended, and by the way, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act passed in 2014. That was passed during the process to develop this document. So here we are. We're going along with integrated regional water management. There was recognition that groundwater wasn't being handled as well as it probably should have been in certain areas of the state. We needed more. The legislature decided that SGMA was the way to go. So now we have IRWM and we have SGMA. So stakeholders basically told us that groundwater is a very important part of IRWM. Now that we have SGMA, we need to think about SGMA. IRWM provides an opportunity for a SGMA implementation, and integrated regional water management principles and practices have all kinds of different values, bring a lot of people to the table, offer more solutions, and panelists will get into that, I'm sure. But I also want to, as a launch point for this discussion, remind some folks here about the Regional Sustainability Summit that occurred in April of this year. We brought folks together across California to talk about building capacity for regional sustainability. And some key points related to our conversation today would be that the summit discussions affirmed the importance of SGMA, but they also reinforced the broader role of IRWM, Regional Water Management Solutions. And also we heard plenty of folks mention that there is a need to enhance the connection between IRWM and SGMA. That's why we're here today, and to listen to these very informative and well-spoken folks. So thank you very much.
Okay, so I'm going to hand this to the panelists in just a moment. Again, let's remember that the discussion here is how do we enhance the connection between these two similar, overlapped, but different starting point programs. Information that DWR has asked us to try to speak to, and this is, giving some framework for the panelists, is, how does IRWM contribute? What are the values that IRWM brings to groundwater management? Number two is, what insights and experiences do you have about how SGMA affected integrated planning or not in your regions? And then third, your thoughts and opinions as to opportunities and challenges for enhancing the connection between SGMA and IRWM, and how DWR can be helpful in that. So with that, we're just going to move down the row, and we're going to start with Lance, and I know he's got some great examples here.
All right, well, good afternoon. I'm up here as a project manager for our local integrated plan that also sits primarily in an adjudicated basin. So you're probably asking me, what are you doing up here on a SGMA panel? Well, the adjudication that's in my area started about 20 years ago. So this is kind of like fast forward SGMA, which is more or less an adjudication of groundwater basins. Fast forward 20 years, and how has integrated planning affected this particular adjudication over, again, last 2 decades? Well, I'm going to just basically try to summarize the last 20 years, the next 5 minutes, and hopefully you'll glean a few lessons learned, at least from my area. What you're going to learn with SGMA is you're going to have to start measuring your basin and reporting it out on an annual basis. And you're going to learn that you're probably not managing your basin as well as you would hope, like, and maybe even mismanaging parts. As you put your water budgets together, you're going to realize that a lot of your resource managers are siloed around your region. And you'll see items on your water balance portfolio that you really never thought of. You take a shower, where does the water go? I'm a groundwater guy, I don't really care. Where does our water come from? I'm a wastewater guy. They import it, the rain falls, I don't care. Okay. Does any water come in from the neighboring basin? You're not really sure. What happens with all the septic tanks in these non-sewered areas? Don't know. Is agriculture so efficient that there's no return flow? Or is there return flow from crops? Not sure. Then you realize that you're in a small basin, and this is all a closed system. Are there environmental demands? You're not really sure. So you're going to see a lot of things on your ledger that are all water, and you're probably looking at this much of it. So once you realize that you're actually trying to manage a system, not one facet of a resource, you realize my water budget, whether I like it or not, or whether I understand it or not, is integrated, because I've got line items and numbers I have to fill on a spreadsheet, okay? So we realized that pretty early on in our adjudication. And we have a mantra around the office, which is, you cannot manage what you do not understand. And one of the things you can do is, you may not understand your water resources, you may not understand how much is going in and how much is going out, but you sure as hell can fight about it. So the thing is, one of the things we learned too is invest in ourselves. You're either going to pay now or you're going to pay later. Scientists are expensive. Attorneys are expensive. If you don't want to pay for the science now, you're going to pay for the attorneys. And then a few years later, after you're done fighting, the judge is going to tell you, go pay for the science. Okay? Now, I am going to get and pivot into the integrated plan. And we got to a point where we actually started to invest in ourselves, invest in science, and understand how this gearbox, this black box of gears, actually is a system of many ins and many outs, and not just a groundwater agency, not just an import agency, wastewater agency, and so forth. We also learned that that integrated planning was a vehicle for us to come together and really understand all the individual gears, the gearbox, and how they work together. Now, conversely, we have a water master report that we submit to a judge every year. Maybe it's like SGMA that you submit to a regulator, maybe it's not. I think there's some similarities. And I'll tell you, the integrated planning process is wholly different than putting together a sterile accounting exercise, slapping a cover on it, and sending it to a judge or a regulator that's going to tell you how to manage your basin. Okay, those two things really they're not connected. You really do need that integrated approach. There's too many facets in operating a natural resource system, and assuming that SGMA or a judge is going to do it for you doesn't really work. The judge usually, when there's a problem, they go into this black box, they pull out a gear, they hammer the gear into a different shape, they shove the gear back into the gearbox, and then the system shambles forward. Is it efficient? Not really. Will it eventually get there? You keep hammering it enough, it'll get there. But it's probably not the way you want to do business. For us, we really wanted to embrace a holistic approach that involved all the stakeholders and, first of all, laid out common objectives. And they're just real simple things. Subsidence is bad. Don't kill the environment. Don't use up all the water. Water quality. We all live in a cat box, and we want to make sure that we keep the cat box clean. So water quality is important. And again, this breaks us out of our individual silos. SGMA's really, in my opinion, at least our adjudication, wasn't a great vehicle to have those conversations. And sometimes these conversations are tongue-in-cheek. There's a lot of trust building. There's a lot of I'm okay, you're okay, and seeing those connections that weren't obvious before. And again, that integrated planning process operates as a safe place, as a think tank, as an area to have conversations. And again, it's very different than an accounting exercise. Ultimately, you hope you get down to creative solutions, and I've got a couple examples, and I'll pass the mic to the right. And I'll give you just a couple of quick examples. Mojave River, inundated with invasive species, okay, salt cedar. Whose problem is it? Is it Fish and Game's, Fish and Wildlife? Is it the Resource Conservation District? Is it the individual cities? Is it the state water contractor, which is us, or the water master? Not really sure. And it's really no one's problem. It's just an unfortunate event that's choking one of the last bits of southwestern riparian habitat. Through the integrated process, you band together, you find partners, and you develop a business case because you see that line item on your ledger getting used up, and that tamarisk is using thousands of acre feet of water. And then you go, well, maybe there's an actual reason to band together and not really try to point the finger at whose jurisdiction it is, but get together and band together and remove these invasive species, which actually remove thousands of acres of invasive species, which creates thousands of acres of new water for the basin. Those kinds of things come out of the integrated process, or something as simple as flood control and your recharge agency coming together, digging one hole that's expensive with taxpayers' dollars. The recharge agency uses about the bottom foot to percolate water, and the flood control district every few years uses the majority of the hole when a flood comes in, okay, for attenuation. These are the kinds of examples that come out of this integrated process. And I've got lots more, and if there's time, we can, I can talk your ear off. But again, these types of things and ideas don't come out of our adjudication. My concern is that it's going to be tough to bring those out of the SGMA process.
Thank you. Courtney Howard, San Luis Obispo County. If you were at the last panel, we're one of those county-based IRWMs. Again, just depending on how you set up your IRWM region, it can have pros and cons to how SGMA can be integrated with your IRWM region. It kind of worked out pretty well for us. We're one of those counties that also has a flood control and water conservation district, the same coterminous boundary, and the same 5 board members for each agency, and sort of kind of maybe the analogy fits where DWR is more of the technical and helping get grants and incentives, and the state board's more regulatory. We sort of had those both hats going for our county too, where the flood control district kept a pulse on conditions, implemented regional projects, and the board, as the county, has the land use authority, looks more at resource management through ordinances and land use. So kind of working all together on that, we have a county-wide water resources advisory committee that brings together all the water purveyors, environmental at large, ag at large, development at large. So it was kind of a natural fit when IRWM came along to just keep going with what we were doing and develop the IRWM plan in accordance with the standards. And so within our county, we have a total of 23 basins, 6 of which are subject to SGMA now. And now we just see the opportunity with SGMA and the formation of groundwater sustainability agencies, where at the groundwater scale, we formed governance structures that can then help look at things at that watershed groundwater level and come up with their sustainable goals and solutions, and then kind of roll that up into at the county level in support of IRWM. So I think one of the big values that IRWM can bring to groundwater management is just that collaborative framework. As each of the 6 basins look at not only demand management but supply enhancement opportunities, they're going to be looking at the regional supplies that the county has available to it. And so we'll need that IRWM forum to come together and look at what the needs are in each of those 6 basins and how they're hoping to leverage what regional water supplies are available. And so we're going to have this kind of natural internal competition for whatever is available. And it might provide that opportunity to think outside the box in terms of exchange opportunities. What kind of supply enhancement opportunities can be done for the coastal basins that can maybe free up other supplies for the inland basins that don't have access to what might be accessible on the coast. So hopefully those are institutional structure that was set up via IRWM can help now invite the GSAs to the table, and we can help take what they do at that sub-regional scale and then roll it up into our regional scale, and then hopefully inform the California Water Plan eventually. So how did SGMA impact IRWM? I think with our county, we were trying to do things at a regional scale, and we didn't have the institutional structures at the groundwater basin scale to actually implement solutions. But now with GSAs, we do have a governance with authority to do those solutions. So I think it's going to be helpful actually for the IRWM program. Unfortunately, it's only 6 of the 23 basins, so while the GSPs and the water balances and solutions that are identified in those will help inform the IRWM plan for the region, we have to fill in the gap with the analysis of the water balances for all the rest of the county and to complete that picture. So that's a little bit of a challenge, but we're trying to leverage the frameworks that are set up under SGMA for methodologies, and also do those for the rest of the county so we can have a consistent picture of current and future conditions and picture of what sustainability looks like, and then what those solutions are that we're going to implement to achieve sustainability. I think a big challenge and how DWR can help, I'm not quite sure, because some of the regulations are just it's just in there, is the timing. And maybe it's just going to have to improve over time, where we have more robust analyses and solutions identified for the basins. Because of the SGMA, the priorities for resources is going to go to those 6 basins in terms of really focusing on those for the technical analysis and solutions. And then we'll have to fill in the rest of the areas and enhance our methodologies there over time. But just the timing of how all the documents come out and consistent messaging about what the conditions are and what the solutions are, it's just going to be a little bit challenging because it's all the same people, just grouped differently, doing this work. So I think it's a common challenge state level and at the local level. Methodologies, though, I think if we can have common data sets, common projections, and common methodologies, I think that would really go a long way to helping reduce inconsistent messages and data sources that can be confusing to the public and just amongst each other. Efficiencies is what we're trying to focus on. If we're both doing the same thing in a silo and we don't know the other other's doing it, sort of like who's going to get there first. And I wish I would have known, so I didn't have to do that, and we can maybe share better. But sometimes it's just hard because we're trying to do our work. So I'd say those are the key ones in terms of going forward. How we can enhance that connection is just lining up the timing, the data availability, and methodologies, and gaining those efficiencies as best we can for common understanding and common messaging, and making sure that we're working in partnership.
Hi, I'm John Ricker with Santa Cruz County. I'm going to talk primarily about the Santa Cruz IRWM region. That region includes most of Santa Cruz County, and it follows watershed boundaries. We have about 4 large watersheds and some smaller coastal watersheds in the region, and we have 2 priority groundwater basins within that region. What the short answer is that for us, IRWM and SGMA complement each other, that SGMA provides tools to implement IRWM, and in turn, IRWM provides tools to implement SGMA for us. We are a small region, but we do not have any single large water agency. We have 4 urban water suppliers within our region. We have the county government, the regional the Resource Conservation District, a couple of sanitation agencies, and 3 cities. All of those are signatories to our IRWM Memorandum of Agreement. We essentially have all the public agencies dealing with water on board for IRWM. All of our water is local. It's a mix of surface water and groundwater. The surface water primarily comes from stream diversions, so we're very dependent on stream flow and very impacted by droughts, and now also impacted by the need to reduce our diversions and leave more water in the stream for the steelhead and the coho. Our groundwater basins are overdrafted. We have depressed groundwater levels. We have seawater intrusion in the coastal basin, and we have depleted stream flow as a result of the overdraft. Those are all issues that we have been well aware of since about the 90s, and we've started to work together in the late 90s to address those issues. The IRWM program really helped to push us together to put together a plan to secure the Prop 50 funding and to work together since then. We have managed to connect all the different water agencies with emergency interties now, and the agencies are now talking about using those interties for conjunctive water use, and basically using our excess winter surface water, treating that and putting that into the groundwater basin so we can both restore the basin and provide storage for drought water supply for the surface water agencies. So it really has worked well for us. It's taken a little while. The surface water, I mean the water supply agencies were talking a good line, but not really wanting to work that closely together until recent years. Now we're really working on joint projects and moving ahead with things that will benefit multiple agencies and potentially the whole region. The sanitation agencies were some of the last ones to come on board, but now that we're talking about the potential for recycled water and purified recycled water use, they're much more engaged in the process as well. Also, through the IRWM program, we were looking at managed aquifer recharge as a tool both to deal with stormwater and to augment our groundwater supplies. And of course, anytime we bring our groundwater back up, we're putting more water into our streams for summer base flow to support the riparian habitat and the steelhead habitat. So we're really seeing a lot of these things as win-win situations that benefit, provide multiple benefits throughout the region and pretty much for all of our agencies. Challenges that we've had, it's really been almost, it's been pretty smooth. We've actually been doing watershed management at the county level since the 70s, so we do have a pretty long history of that and engaging with our stakeholders. Some of our private citizens, we end up with a new batch of them, it seems like almost every 5 years, and have to start all over again with the education process. And we've had a new batch come out of the woodwork now with SGMA, and so some of those meetings are interesting. Our GSAs are joint powers authorities with multiple agencies in each GSA, and then we also bring in some of the other stakeholder agencies and the private well owners as with representation on our GSA board. So we are trying to reach out and engage with everybody in those particular basins. So it's been a pretty successful program. Obviously, the state funding and technical assistance has helped us out, and we're looking forward to that as we move forward with developing our groundwater sustainability plans. And we really appreciate the approach of SGMA in terms of laying out the framework, but letting us define how we do it, as opposed to, say, the stormwater program, which I'm also involved in, which is a very prescriptive program and kind of directs us to spend limited local resources and local funding and things that may or may not have that much long-term impact. But SGMA so far looks like it's providing a good model for us to move ahead and address our issues.
So for those of you who aren't familiar with the Kings River region and the Tulare Lake hydrologic region in general, we're the most colorful portions of the maps that you see coming out of DWR these days, the bullseye, as we like to call it. And so thank us primarily, I guess, for SGMA. We do have some positive things going on, despite Dave's glowing introduction of our region. Our IRWM group has, fallen apart to a certain degree, but not entirely. And so we're still doing some really good things. Our agency, Kings River Conservation District, covers primarily two subbasins, the King Subbasin, which is approximately 1 million acres, and then the Tulare Lake Subbasin, which is about 525,000 acres. And so it's a pretty sizable area. It's highly dependent on groundwater, as you might guess. And so the claim that there's a direct nexus and fit is probably, that point is most strongly made, I think, for areas like the South Central Valley. But we also think that there's some things that are unique that are outside the scope of SGMA that probably warrant significantly the continuance of IRWM in the region, and that we continue to promote as the reason that we continue to plan that way in the South Valley. For one thing, the two subbasins I just described, the King Subbasin has a long history of integrated planning. As Dave mentioned, we started this in 2001 and have been actively meeting. Over time, we've significantly expanded the stakeholder group up to 54 members and interested parties that span the spectrum of interest groups, developed very strong relationships, I was actually discussing that with a colleague of mine in the audience earlier, and we joked that we probably wouldn't be sitting next to each other today if it hadn't been for IRWM. So, I think that the foundation that IRWM created for SGMA, at least in the King Subbasin, was very important. It's, I think, catapulted a lot of the efforts that are going to be required, particularly with stakeholder outreach and identifying needs in the development of the plans is going to be very important. Some of the studies. So, again, the King Subbasin is highly dependent on groundwater. So, in the development of its initial plan, the first task was to develop a hydrologic model. And this was before DWR's model. This was before the CVHM that, or at least in its modern form, that was developed by USGS. And so we saw a need to develop that so we could better understand what our overdraft issue was. That was the main objective, and continues to be, I think, for any of the subbasins in the South Valley under SGMA. So that work is really allowing us to kind of shortcut some of the effort that would be required in a very short time frame too. We also were very lucky too that those relationships were formed and crafted without a whole lot of pressure. So we're up against a statutory deadline here to get plans done. And in the meantime, we got to work really quick to develop those relationships that are still out there and remaining, that we need to reach out to those stakeholders who maybe we had missed in the IRWM process to understand what their needs and concerns are. But that's not as heavy of a lift as it would have been, I think. This has also spawned a number of other coordination efforts that I think are very valuable. One of them is called the Central Valley Groundwater Monitoring Collaborative, and so that's all of these different entities, regulatory primarily, such as Irrigated Lands Regulatory Program, the Dairy Program, Oil Fields Project, and others, to develop smart monitoring networks where we're not duplicating efforts, wasting money and effort. And so I think that's a really important one. With disadvantaged communities, I think we've been very successful too. Under Proposition 84, the Tulare Lake Hydrologic Region was the recipient of a $2 million grant to do essentially a needs assessment. And then the King Subbasin also received a separate grant. Some others basins did as well, or planning groups did in the state. And that information, what we learned, the relationships that were developed there are going to be invaluable and have been already invaluable in the development of the groundwater sustainability plans, or at least to the extent we have to this point. What else do I need to say here? The one thing that I would caution is, first of all, fully supportive of the bottom-up approach. It was discussed at a previous panel. I'll give an example of where something might be pretty good for some, but be detrimental to others. One in particular that really was kind of a waste of time and resources for us was SB 985. There's a lot of discussion about recycled water on the coastal areas of the state. We've been doing that because we've had no choice for a very long time in the Central Valley. We're closed systems. By comparison, I think we've been very smart in how we recycle that water. There are cooperative arrangements between cities and agricultural interests to use that water for irrigation in lieu of groundwater pumping. So in the end, we're all in one basin, and we've been able to tackle that. But now, because of this mandate, we're required to go and develop a stormwater resources plan to describe the things that we've already been doing, and that in large part have already been described in our IRWM plan and in other plans. And so I also just, to that point, I would just caution too that the term integration concerns me sometimes, because there's a degree to which you can safely integrate. You don't want to completely erode the individual processes. I actually searched for this and I couldn't find it, but I know I've heard DWR staff mention this many times, that IRWM plans are really intended to be plans of plans. And I'm concerned that potentially there's an effort to have full integration where basically it's at least at a local level, the IRWM plans top down, kind of helping to facilitate what goes on with SGMA. And I think that maybe that might work for some areas, but not for others. Our area is highly dependent on groundwater, and our plan really describes that. Our implementation efforts illustrate that. But bear in mind too that if you look at the map of IRWM areas throughout the state, there are some that have very little if any, area that is subject to the Act. And so you don't want to boilerplate something and then cause an adverse impact to those particular areas that's too prescriptive and difficult to deal with, such as with SB 985 for us. Thank you.
Thanks to all my colleagues on the panel that went before. I either don't have much left to add, or I do. I have, what, 15 more minutes. I guess to start, I kind of want to reiterate some of the things Dave said about my background. So, you know, for the past about 9.5 years, I've been managing 2 regional joint powers agencies in the Sacramento region, one of which, Regional Water Authority, among other things, houses the Integrated Regional Water Management Group. The other, the Sacramento Groundwater Authority, has become the GSA over our service area. So, you know, I have hats on in both these realms. And then for about that same period of time prior to that, I was at DWR and at the beginning of IRWM and trying to figure out what that meant and how to develop it and how to use grant money to make some things happen, but also manage the groundwater programs at DWR. So, you know, when I think about these things, I come from a lot of different places, and I like to think I've forgotten more about IRWM and groundwater management than I ever knew. That was a joke. So I want to start off with some comments in general about SGMA and IRWM, and then maybe dive down into the region that I come from and how it's affected us. But I think Lance said this, and I'll just paraphrase and kind of say SGMA really isn't about groundwater or just groundwater. It really is about integrated water management through a groundwater lens, and I think Lance characterized that well. When you start doing your SGMA water budget, all of a sudden, if you've only been a groundwater manager, you're going to realize, wow, there's a bunch of things I never had to think about. But that's a good thing, because I think that provides opportunities, and especially in those areas where you have a scarce resource, like Dave described and Eric. You know, any drop of water you can generate through management of the whole water resource, offset groundwater use, recharge groundwater, whatever it might be, is something that somebody doesn't have to give up. And so, you know, to the extent groups are devolving into everybody backing into their corner so they can fight over that small pie they have left, that's, you know, the scarcity model is probably not the most productive. And I think ultimately they will come back together and realize that. So again, IRWM and SGMA, I think, are 2 different institutional frameworks around the same issue. And I think the better you can coordinate the strengths and weaknesses of each, the better you're going to be at solving your problems. And so, you know, as far as aligning those, I think SGMA clearly identifies some objectives, and they're objectives that, you know, if your IRWM overlies a medium or high priority basin and you didn't have objectives around groundwater management before, you were probably missing the boat. So, you know, those objectives are clearly defined now, and there's also responsibility for them. So groundwater overdraft and subsidence and seawater intrusion and all those groundwater mismanagement problems can't be subsidized by pushing off the negative impacts onto somebody else anymore, in theory. So it, you know, it creates that clear objective. It creates some authorities to deal with that. Clearly, that was the intent of the law, was to create tools to be able to solve these problems. It creates the opportunity to fund some of these things. And, you know, that's important. That's something that IRWM hasn't necessarily had in a lot of places. And it's been dependent on the state funneling enough funding to keep it alive in some places. On the IRWM side, it's you know, it brings a culture of inclusiveness, stakeholder involvement, collaboration, and some innovation around the thinking that maybe groundwater management hasn't fully had in the past. So, you know, I think to the extent we marry these two and align all the objectives around management of the whole water resource, there's a lot of opportunities to accomplish a lot, I think. You know, there are those who have said the key to IRWM and making it sustainable is giving it some legislative authority. And I disagree with that. And I disagree with it because IRWMs have been free to develop however they want in their region. And that's been very beneficial, but they are very different. And I think mandating that they have some role, I think, is going to ruin a lot about what's good about IRWM. So I think this could be a match made in heaven, a very strict, clear GSA responsibility, authorities, potential for funding, and this collaborative entrepreneurial IRWM groups working together to solve problems. So back in a way to the American River Basin story, and I think you know, much like Lance was talking about, you know, SGMA, both IRWM and SGMA, I think weren't really a big new issue we need to face because we're kind of already doing it. And in the Sacramento region in the early 1990s, we had a number of problems. We had growing population, growing economy, the need to divert more and more surface water into the future to serve those demands. We had declining groundwater levels, you know, on average 2 feet a year. 80 feet of groundwater overdraft in the kind of post-World War II era out to the early 90s. We had some major groundwater contamination plumes. We're sitting on top of one right now, but also aerojet south of the American River. We had major legal battles over surface water diversion. We had threatened steelhead in the American River, lower American River, that needed to be protected. So we needed to come together around how we're going to solve these problems. We need more water for the people, but we get sued by the environmentalists every time we try to do it. We need more water for the people locally. At the same time, the county of Sacramento suing East Bay Mud to not take water they had from the Central Valley Project. So the powers that be at the time, largely county and city officials, created something called the Sacramento Water Forum and brought together business representatives, brought together local environmental representatives, brought together water suppliers, and brought together the public represented by the municipalities that in some cases are the water supplier, but also have, you know, the broader well-being of their citizens. And some of Lisa Butler's predecessors when she was at the California, I forget what they even call themselves now, CCCP, yeah. You know, they said, you know, I think 18 months we can sit down. It's going to be a lot of work, hammer out a deal, and 7 years later, there was a deal that all those parties signed on to, and it included a handful of elements, and it was really a precursor of our integrated regional water management plan. It included identifying flows and temperatures in the American River. I'm getting the signal that I'm going on too long. Suffice it to say, you know, we began IRWM in the years 1998-99. And then when funding came along to do this thing, it was a good thing for us. We were already going there. We began groundwater management as a part of this water forum agreement in 1998. SGMA is kind of doing the logistics of looking at what we're doing, making sure it complies with the new law, but we're not faced with these major new pressures and no idea how to come together to do it.
Thank you all. I'm going to warn anybody who ever gets in this position again, when John Woodling says he wants the anchor, don't let him have the anchor. No, seriously, that was all very, very good, and frankly, I think we could sit here another hour and have a deeper dive into this conversation, but being a good moderator, I have to keep time. We had planned for about a 5-minute Q&A, so I'm going to not recap quite yet and give you all an opportunity to, for the next 3-4 minutes, if somebody has questions, not statements, but questions for the panel, we can try to address them. Yes, Steve?
Thanks to the panel. Very insightful. Learned a lot and well stated. Just real quickly, do you think the requirements for the groundwater sustainability plan in your areas may change the way GSAs are organized and might encourage some consolidation or even splitting in different ways?
Why don't each of you, if possible, just a quick response to that in terms of, do you think, I think what I heard was, do you see GSA structure and governance evolving as plan components are developed?
Our GSAs are already conformed to our basin boundaries, so I think they're going to be pretty stable.
So yeah, we have cases where we have multiple GSAs overlying one basin. In developing our agreements amongst those GSAs to develop one plan for the basin, we recognize that there's going to be another decision point once the plan's developed on how to implement the plan. And part of implementing the plan may mean that we need to form a JPA to actually get things done. But it could turn out that it says, you GSA, you're going to do this, and the county, you have this authority, so you do this in terms of demand management maybe, or land use, whatever those strategies are, and who is the appropriate entity to implement those strategies could influence the outcome of how that changes. But yes, we did recognize in developing our coordination agreements for developing one plan that that's going to be a decision point to revisit the structure.
Not sure if that was directed to me or not, but because of Dave's comment earlier, but I'll answer for the Kings and the Tulare Lake subbasins. It's pretty interesting because the King subbasin had an IRWM to start with, as Dave mentioned, and I followed up with it later, and then fragmented back to their own agency level. Actually, what even more interesting is it wasn't really the agency level. They actually fell back to their boundaries under their coordinated SB 1938 plans. And that's really how we started our meetings initially, and maybe that's our fault. But even without having the IRWM process in the Tulare Lake subbasin to the south, although multiple GSAs are formed, they're going to develop a single plan. At least that's the direction they're going. So their scope work for development of a plan is to get as far as they can and hopes reach the goal line to develop a single plan that they all adopt, with possibly certain off-ramps in case they meet some obstacle that's just insurmountable. Whereas the opposite is happening in the King subbasin, they're going to develop individual plans and in a coordinated fashion, and then if they get to the point where they're like, this is really a distinction without a difference, we should just mush this all together into a single plan, that might happen. Regarding the GSAs, that may happen too, just from economies of scale. I mean, there are some small GSAs, and I wonder how they're going to make it, not just from a geographic scale, but also just from a resources level too, both water resources and financial. And so my personal opinion is that there will be some consolidation in our area. How much, I'm not sure, and it'll probably occur over a pretty lengthy period of time.
Question here. Yes, Colin.
Yeah. Sorry, John, did you want to answer?
No, it's all right.
Okay. Colin Bailey with the Environmental Justice Coalition for Water. Quick question about the intersection of IRWM, SGMA, and disadvantaged communities. From our perspective, it has in some ways felt like just as disadvantaged communities were starting to get a foothold in the IRWM realm through the involvement program, the emphasis has shifted tremendously towards SGMA, and it has been a lot less open than IRWM. Some of you spoke, I think Lance and Eric in particular spoke to some of the synergies that are there. In speaking with R.I. Asdarian with the San Luis Delta Mendota Water Authority, they're putting out a holistic disadvantaged community outreach plan or solicitation for SGMA, for the involvement program for SRF, the whole shebang, there's a current solicitation open to support GSP formation. What are your plans with respect to how to dovetail maybe the gains you've done with disadvantaged communities in the involvement program, needs assessment, outreach, et cetera, and SGMA in this upcoming grant round?
So does everyone have DACs? I mean, I know that certainly the Kings does. Everybody here have disadvantaged community stakeholders to deal with. So maybe just, again, time management. John, would you speak to that, and then Lance?
Yeah, and you know, we being in largely, you know, the urbanized portion of northern Sacramento County, we don't have DACs. If DACs are standalone communities, somewhat isolated, we certainly have economically disadvantaged parts of water agency service areas, but they're served by water systems. So, you know, we don't have to address the needs quite as directly. I think the IRWM DAC involvement grant funds need to pick that up, and if we're going to integrate IRWM and SGMA, that's something that needs to be a part of taking advantage of, as you say, how DACs have gotten involved in IRWM and leverage that into SGMA.
I'm going to add private well owners to that group too.
I'm going to ask Lance to close this up, and then we're right up against the clock, so I'll do a quick recap.
Yeah, even though, you know, we're not really dealing with SGMA, we do have an adjudication, which I'm using as an analog. And I will say that gone through a couple rounds of integrated plans. In our 2005 plan, disadvantaged communities weren't even on the radar screen. In our 2014 update, they were one of our highest priority, highest immediacy programs, and we've done a lot through the proposition to do a bunch of things for disadvantaged communities in our area. Conversely, disadvantaged communities aren't even part of the conversation with our adjudication, with our groundwater adjudication, which again is a counting exercise. We turn it over to a judge to make sure that the basin is sustainable. They're not even part of that conversation. So, yeah, I think that it kind of shows maybe the compare and contrast against what we're trying to accomplish with SGMA or adjudications, their general purpose, and kind of the bigger picture, more holistic things we're trying to tackle as a watershed or as a region through IRWM. And yeah, you're right. It's disadvantaged communities, again, weren't even part of the conversation or didn't have as much of a voice 10 years ago like they are currently through IRWM.
Okay, so we're up against the clock. Let me do a 30-second recap. Remember the questions that we presented at the beginning. I have four kind of takeaways here. One is we heard consistently that this local management approach works and is actually preferred. Several of the panelists made that comment. IRWM clearly set up foundation for collaboration. You know, those who had good IRWMs had good relationships, trust relationships established, and also translated into some good data to build into sustainable groundwater sustainability actions. I really am surprised that SGMA really didn't derail integrated planning processes, but rather is being viewed as tools. And, you know, somebody said tools both ways, right? That SGMA gives GSAs tools that can help integrated planning, and integrated planning has tools that can help SGMA. That's important. And then finally, just this need for continued technical assistance, support, and consistency as these plans kind of merge together. So that I get the privilege of summarizing. Hopefully that's close. Thank you to the panelists, and thank you all for a good discussion.